Nazi Germany's Court of Fear, and the judge who ran it. Good evening, dear friends. On July 20th, 1944, inside a heavily guarded military compound in East Prussia, a briefcase exploded beneath a conference table. For a few moments, it seemed as though history itself might have changed course. Adolf Hitler survived, and with that survival came a reckoning. What followed was not simply retaliation. It was something colder, more deliberate. A transformation of justice into spectacle and of law into a weapon. In the days after the failed attempt, thousands of Germans were swept into a system designed not to seek truth, but to display loyalty. At the center of that system stood one man. A judge who did not whisper authority. He screamed it. A courtroom where outcomes were decided before a single word was spoken. The question this story forces us to confront is not only how a legal system can collapse, but how easily it can be made to serve power when fear replaces conscience. Roland Freisler did not enter history as a battlefield figure or a strategist of war. He entered it through a courtroom. Born in 1893, educated in law, and shaped by the upheaval of the First World War, Freisler emerged from Germany's collapse not searching for restraint, but for certainty. Captured on the Eastern Front and held for years in Russian captivity, he absorbed language, discipline, and a rigid worldview that would later define his legal philosophy. When he returned to Germany, the nation he found was fractured, resentful, and vulnerable to voices promising order at any cost. Freisler found his path within that promise. Trained as a jurist, he rejected the idea of law as a neutral arbiter. To him, law was a weapon. By the mid-1920s, he had joined the Nazi movement and quickly distinguished himself not by judgment, but by aggression. In courtrooms, he shouted down opponents, intimidated colleagues, and blurred the boundary between advocacy and intimidation. Yet these traits did not hinder his rise. They accelerated it. In a movement that valued forceful loyalty over measured thought, Freisler's volatility was an asset. After the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Freisler became instrumental in reshaping German law. He worked inside the justice system to align legal language with racial and ideological doctrine. Citizenship, family life, and personal conduct were redefined through abstract categories of worth and belonging. Law no longer asked what an individual had done. It asked who they were and whether they fit within the state's approved vision of society. Under this transformation, legality lost its moral anchor and became an extension of power. Despite his loyalty, Freisler never became part of Hitler's inner circle. He was too erratic, too theatrical, and politically inconvenient. Instead, he was placed where his temperament could be fully exploited: the People's Court. This institution was not created to evaluate evidence or protect rights. It existed to enforce obedience and display consequences. When Freisler became its president in 1942, the court ceased even the appearance of neutrality. In Freisler's courtroom, outcomes were decided before proceedings began. He dominated every moment, combining the roles of prosecutor, judge, and moral authority. His conduct was deliberately overwhelming. Defendants were interrupted, mocked, and deprived of dignity. Legal procedure became irrelevant. What mattered was submission. The process itself was designed to intimidate not only those on trial, but anyone watching. Freisler understood performance. He wore vivid robes, presided beneath symbols of state authority, and used his voice as a tool of domination. He shifted without warning from analytical questioning to furious outbursts. This was not a lack of control. It was calculated. The objective was psychological collapse. When individuals are denied the space to speak, to think, or to compose themselves, resistance becomes nearly impossible. This machinery turned relentlessly against anyone deemed disloyal. Students who circulated leaflets questioning the war were dragged before the court. Their words were treated not as ideas, but as threats. When one young woman calmly stated that many shared her views but lacked the courage to express them, the courtroom briefly fell silent. Her composure exposed the imbalance of power. Freisler responded with anger, not argument. Reason had no place where authority felt challenged. As the war intensified and Germany's situation deteriorated, the People's Court grew more severe. After the failed July 20th attempt to remove Hitler in 1944, the regime unleashed a vast internal purge. Thousands were arrested. Trials were rushed. Proceedings were filmed, not for justice, but for instruction. The state wanted its population to see what defiance cost. Freisler presided over these cases with escalating ferocity. Defendants were deliberately weakened, confused, and humiliated. The courtroom became a theater of power, where fear replaced evidence. Yet something unexpected emerged from these final trials. Many of those accused, stripped of any hope for mercy, spoke with clarity. They did not plead. They did not beg. Some reminded Freisler that power is temporary. Others warned that history has a long memory. These words did not alter their fate, but they revealed something critical. The authority judging them was not strong. It was desperate. Freisler's rage was not confidence. It was insecurity masked as dominance. His shouting, his insults, his refusal to listen were symptoms of a system that could no longer tolerate doubt. By early 1945, the world Freisler served was collapsing. Allied forces advanced, cities lay in ruins, and institutions that once projected absolute control were unraveling. During an air raid on Berlin, Freisler remained inside the courthouse, gathering files and documents. Even as the system failed around him, he clung to records of authority, as though paper could preserve power. The building was struck. Whether by falling debris or explosive force, Freisler was killed instantly. When his body was brought to a hospital, a brief remark was made. No one responded. There was no public mourning, no ceremony, no legacy to defend. The man who had demanded fear received silence. Freisler's story is not about one judge. It is about how institutions decay when law becomes an instrument of ideology. The People's Court did not appear overnight. It evolved step by step through small compromises, redefined principles, and the gradual normalization of injustice. Each stage was justified as necessary. Each step narrowed the space for conscience. What remains is a warning. Systems do not abandon justice all at once. They do so incrementally under the language of order, security, and loyalty. When law no longer protects the individual from power, it becomes a stage where outcomes are decided before questions are asked. And when that happens, the most dangerous figure is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the society that stops listening. This story does not belong only to the past. It reminds us that injustice rarely begins with chaos. It begins with permission. Permission to redefine law, to narrow empathy, and to replace accountability with loyalty. Roland Freisler did not act alone. He operated within a system that rewarded certainty over truth and obedience over conscience. His courtroom was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a society that allowed power to go unchecked. History teaches us that when law serves ideology instead of humanity, outcomes are decided long before questions are asked. And when voices of dissent are treated as threats, justice becomes performance. The final question is not what happened to Freisler. It is what happens when systems like his are allowed to form again, quietly, legally, and with thunderous applause. What would we recognize first? The danger or the robes?